back with you, especially on the occasion of a visit by Judge Sandra O'Connor. We will have an opportunity to engage her about this book. This is a book called called Lazy Bee, Growing Up on a Cattle Ranch in the American Southwest. It really is a portrait of a place. Pulitzer Prize-winning David Garrow said, "Everyone who is a student of this court will read this book very enthusiastically, not because it's going to tell you why Justice O'Connor voted a certain way on a certain case, but to get a personal insight on who this lady is beyond what you see in judicial opinions that by their nature are pretty impersonal. The way in which she remembers her life automatically will illuminate how she views the world." Walter Dellinger, a friend of mine from North Carolina who was acting Solicitor General, said about her, "I don't remember another historical instance when it was so clear who the next Chief Justice would and should be." She has been on the court for 21 years, appointed in 1981 by Ronald Reagan. She was born in El Paso, Texas. She grew up and then went to Stanford University and Stanford Law School, where another Stanford Law School student was Chief Justice Rehnquist. I am pleased to have this opportunity to welcome to you the author of Lazy Bee, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor.
All right. Thank you. I can't see you.
No, you can't see them.
No, I can't see you.
They can't. She's saying, "I can't see you," which is true. When you look at with all the lights, stage lights in, you can't see the audience. But no, we're not going to have that. We're here to talk about a book and engage in a conversation about a very interesting life. So, all right. Out of respect for the people in the audience and respect for Justice O'Connor, I hope you will act in a responsible manner with respect to this appearance this evening. I have lots of questions, and we will also take some of your questions, which during the process of this conversation, Justice, they will be brought to me, and then I will ask those questions that you write. Remember to make them as specific and as precise and as short as you possibly can. What we want are questions and not statements, and we will have a wonderful evening with Justice O'Connor. Welcome to the 92nd Street Y.
Thank you.
Let me begin by talking about this book, and we will talk about the court as much as you can talk about it as a sitting justice. Why write this book about growing up in the Southwest?
I wrote it with my brother because the ranch was sold in the mid-1990s. It had been in the family for 113 years, and I had thought it would always be there. It was this place where all of us could go, and we were always welcome there. And it was a sanctuary. We knew just what it was and just how it would be and all the people there. And I assumed that would be there for my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and on through the generations. And when it was sold, it was devastating to me. And for some years, I couldn't even bring myself to think about it. I had to block it out. And finally, my brother and I had a discussion and thought, we would try to put down some of those memories on paper. We weren't sure whether it would warrant publication. That wasn't our objective, but that's why it came about.
And you decided to do it with him?
Yes, because my brother, who's much younger than I, spent his whole adult life working on the Lazy Bee Ranch. After he got out of the University of Arizona, he married, and he returned to the ranch and worked there until it was sold. And he had a great many more institutional memories of the place than I did, because I went away to school from kindergarten on, and I was there summers and holidays and Christmas and Easter, but didn't spend all of my time there as he did.
What are your first memories?
Sounds.
Sounds?
sounds. In the first place, I don't know how many people who live in a city have ever been in a place where there is total silence.
Total
No sound at all. And when the wind wasn't blowing, and when the cattle weren't making noises, it was absolutely silent. You could hear an ant crawling around on the ground. Yeah. And when the wind blew, then we had these big windmills. They were the largest windmills of the type ever built, big Samson mills. And when the wind turned them, they would creak. And the wells were 800 feet deep, and the sucker rods went down the casing of the well. And as the wheel turned, the sucker rods moved up and down in the well casing to bring the water up, and they made noise. And that was the noise we accustomed to hear.
Tell me about your father.
He was wonderful, I thought. He was so intelligent, and he could do anything. He could make anything work. He could build anything. He could fix anything. And he was the veterinarian to the cattle, and he was the doctor to all of us or the cowboys if anything went wrong. We were really a long way, hundreds of miles from medical help. He was everything, and he made life fun. It was a lonely place to be in some ways, and when he would go around the ranch, he wanted company. So if I were there, he'd like me to go with him out doing whatever we had to do. And I liked to read, so I might have my nose in a book, and I wanted to finish my Nancy Drew mystery and not go running around the ranch. But he'd say, well, you need to go because I have something to show you. Well, what do you have to show me? Well, I won't tell you. You'll have to come and see. Well, how do I know it's something I want to see? I promise you, this is something you won't want to miss. So he'd get my curiosity up, and I'd go with him, and sure enough, he would have found some special thing to show me or to do that would make that trip particularly worthwhile.
Now, you and your brother see your father differently.
Yes, that was really the only place working on the book where we had to work this out, because my brother came back after the university and worked at the ranch with my father. Now, my father thought he was right about everything. And I used to have some arguments with him. I went off to Stanford, and I was studying Keynesian economics. That didn't sit well on the Lazy Bee Ranch. And I remember coming home.
Because of Keynesian theory, or?
Because of the theory. And I would remember coming home, and we'd get in these heated debates around the dinner table over Keynesian theories, and he wasn't sure at all that I was learning the right thing. But he thought he at least knew how everything should be done on the Lazy Bee Ranch. We had Hereford cattle, right, and he had bred them so that they would not have horns, and he had produced what he thought was a wonderful herd of cattle. And when my brother went to work there, he thought we should change to Barzona cattle. Well, you know, this was sort of difficult to work out. And my brother thought if the truck was old, we ought to get a new one. And my father didn't believe in spending money if he didn't absolutely have to. So they had a lot of tension between them. And I never experienced that. So our observations of our father were somewhat different.
And your mother?
We agreed that she was fantastic. She had been living in El Paso, and she had was living a city life, went to parties, played the piano, had a nice singing voice, had gone to the University of Arizona, had taught school for a little while. She loved nice clothes, and she enjoyed people and parties and liked to dance. And here she married this man who had absolutely nothing. And he was stuck out on this ranch, miles from anything. And the house at that time was a 4-room adobe house. It was surrounded by a screen porch, and the cowboys slept on the porch. It had no indoor plumbing. It had no running water. There was no electricity. And she was going to go out there and live on that ranch. Well, she and my father had truly fallen in love. They were really deeply in love with each other.
So she was prepared to make that sacrifice.
She did.
No
Her
parties.
parents didn't approve, and they went off and eloped and got married in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and went on to the ranch. And my grandmother's parting words to her daughter were, Ada Mae, don't ever learn to milk the cow.
Did she?
No, she never did. And she must have had a lot of good sense, because I never saw her go out on the ranch without being covered for the sun. You know, I was in the generation that thought having a suntan was the most important thing there was. And when I went to Stanford, we'd go to the beach and lie out in the sun hoping to get a tan. Well, you'd never do that today, I guess. And she knew better. She'd wear a hat, gloves, long sleeves. And she was always very well dressed. I don't know how she managed.
John McCain preaches that message better than anyone else today.
He does. He's had some experience firsthand.
And is really strongly a strong advocate
Yes.
at every opportunity. What we want to know most of all is understanding this experience, how it shaped you, your attitude towards life, your attitude about important values.
Well, it surely must have done that, but I think our early
Kind of rugged individualism
experiences
might
shape
be?
all of us.
Sure.
Growing up on a ranch, I think you learn to value a can-do mentality. If something goes wrong,
Can do for yourself.
yes, you have to be able to fix it, make it work, solve the problem, go on, because you can't call anybody. And other people are very dependent on what you do, so you have to learn to be reasonably dependable, I think. And truth is very much valued. Decency, honesty, being articulate and working with words isn't much valued. And here I am trying to work with words.
In this book or in your life?
In my life, in my work.
In terms of writing opinions and
But
the
that
like.
isn't the kind of thing that had much standing on the ranch life.
But you left that ranch and went to one of the great universities in the world, Stanford, as an undergraduate.
Right.
Did well, went to the law school, was editor of the Law Review.
Met my husband.
Met your husband, John O'Connor, there?
At law school.
At law school. And it said that you dated Bill Rehnquist, did you?
Well,
We what? John?
now, here, I'm about to tell you. We were in the same class in law school.
Yeah.
And he was a marvelous student. He was the star of the class, so that was fun to watch him in class. He really was excellent.
Well,
And-
you weren't doing bad yourself.
Well, fair, but he was a star. And I lived at a graduate women's co-op sort of a place. It was the home of Mrs. Cubberly, whose husband had been the head of the Department of Education at Stanford, and he had died. It was a large redwood home overlooking the bay, and Mrs. Cubberly was alone in it, and she opened it to graduate women to live there, which was wonderful because there was no housing for graduate women. And so Bill Rehnquist would come up sometimes and we'd play charades, or we'd play bridge, or we'd sometimes go to movies, and all those things. He was just kind of...
Well, but I mean, Bill, I've interviewed him twice. He's a funny, interesting
He is.
man.
Yes. Has a good sense of humor. And he loves games.
Yes.
So that was a good thing to do.
But what was it growing up on the ranch that gave you this academic interest, this academic bent? Was it your mother or your father, or is it just there?
Oh, probably just reading books. My parents both loved to read. And
So
my
books
mother,
had a real place at the
oh,
ranch.
they did. They were my friends. I didn't have any other children around. The books were my friends.
And your view of the world.
I
It was
suppose.
almost an exposure
Well,
to the world.
yes. And anyway, reading was very important, so I think it was not unnatural to want to get an education.
So you get out of Stanford Law School. What do you want to do?
I was dying to practice law. And I thought, oh,
This'll
gee,
be
I'll go
easy.
get a job.
Because
Yes.
I did very well in law school, so
Sure.
it'll be automatic.
Right, and there were all these notices on our bulletin board at the law school asking our class to please apply to this firm and that and have an interview because they wanted to
Okay, now
talk
just
to
for the record, where
graduates.
did you stand in your class?
Stanford never officially kept
Okay,
class
but you were editor of the
records.
Law Review.
I was. I
Okay,
was
so
on
that's
the law
pretty
review.
good. That's the highest
Pretty good,
review you
pretty
can,
good.
the highest
Pretty good, right.
achievement.
Yeah.
So you see all these ads on all saying we want the best and brightest to come work for our firm.
Yes, but I couldn't get an interview. I called
They wouldn't
them
even
all.
interview you.
No. And I had
boy.
a friend at Stanford
This
as
would
an
make me a feminist so
undergraduate.
fast if I was you.
Well, it was very interesting. I had this friend, and her father was a partner in a major California law firm. And I said, ask your father why I can't get an interview at his law firm.
Yeah, what's wrong with me?
And she did, and so her father arranged for me to go down to Los Angeles for an interview. And I talked to the interviewing partner, you know, as we're sitting here, and he chatted for a while about what I'd been doing. And then he said, well, Miss Day, how do you type? And I said,
With
well,
my hands.
you know, fair, not great, but fair. And he said, well, I could probably get you a job here as a legal secretary if you wanted. But he said, you know, we've never hired a woman as a lawyer here, and I just don't think that we'll be doing that in the future.
And so what did you think?
Well, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, not a legal
No,
secretary.
but I mean, were you angry? I mean, were you
Well, I was-
outraged? Here you
No,
were.
I was
had a-
disappointed.
just disappointed?
Disappointed.
You had
And
gone to
I-
law school and you were
Yes.
the star of your class.
But I was
editor of
hearing
the
that.
Law Review.
I was hearing that from other law firms too, and
Yeah.
I finally got the message. When I went around and looked, I realized none of them were hiring women lawyers.
Yeah.
So then I had to figure out, well, who was? And the first places that were really hiring women as lawyers were public law offices. U.S. attorney, district attorney, county attorney, some state job of some kind. And I had met John, and we were planning to get married. He was in the next class,
Right.
so if we were going to get married and if we planned to eat, one of us had to work. And I thought it would be nice to work at being a lawyer.
Sure.
So I asked the district attorney of San Mateo County if he would consider me for a job. And it was a wonderful man. He was Louis DeMatteis, and he'd been elected as district attorney in San Mateo County. Italian-American, big Italian-American
What's the largest city in
community.
San Mateo County?
Well, I don't know now. The county seat was in Redwood City.
Okay.
And there was this beautiful old courthouse with a fabulous dome on it with stained glass. It was just wonderful. It still stands today.
Yeah.
And his offices were in that building, and he had once had a woman on his staff, lawyer. And I thought, well, if he could have one, he could have another. I mean, he could hire another one. So we had a big talk, and he said, well, first of all, I don't have an opening.
Right.
Second of all, I don't even have a place to put you. I don't have an empty office. And I said, well, you know, if need be, I'll work for you for nothing. And if you don't have a place for me to sit, I'll sit with your secretary if she'll have me. And he said, oh, well, I'll think about it. So I went back to the Lazy Bee to sort of get ready for our wedding, which was going to be at the Lazy Bee Ranch in December. 50 years ago, next December.
All right.
Yeah.
Now we
And
but we can't celebrate at the Lazy Bee.
no, we can't, so we're going to have to think of something else, I guess. But anyway, I wrote him a letter from the Lazy Bee and spelled out all the reasons why I thought I could be useful in his office and why he should hire me. And when I got back, he did see me, and he did say, well, we'll make do here. I've looked at the budget, and we'll pay you a little something, and you will have to share space with my secretary, but come on and go to work.
And what's amazing about this to me is this, we're talking like 1952, 53. 52. Eisenhower's about to become president.
Right.
You can't get a job in a law firm. They won't even interview you.
No.
And you go to San Mateo County, and you've got a man who's willing to have you come in
Right.
under special circumstances.
But the good thing was, It was a great place to work.
Right.
And my immediate supervisor was just marvelous. He was a man named Keith Sorensen, and he was a really good lawyer, and we were doing legal work for all the various county officers and agencies and boards and commissions. And my classmates who'd gone to work for law firms were just doing drudge work, taking depositions,
Yeah, I
doing
know,
dull stuff.
Yeah, but that's small
And I was having
satisfaction. That's
fun.
small satisfaction.
Well, no. Now, so let me tell you what happened.
All right.
So the district attorney, Louis DeMatteis, was made a judge in the county, appointed judge. So that slot was open, and my supervisor, Keith Sorensen, became the district attorney, and that opened up a marvelous slot, which Keith Sorensen gave me.
So Sandra Day O'Connor is on her way.
On my way. It was just wonderful.
Now, what did you think you were going to have a life in politics then, or?
No, in a public
life.
service kind of position. I loved it. It was really great. And most of my life, I've been in that area, not exclusively, but most of it. Then the problem was, John got drafted.
Yeah.
It was the Korean War. And I kept my job while he was at Fort Ord getting basic training. And then he got a commission in the Judge Advocate General's Corps and was sent to Charlottesville, Virginia. And we hadn't been married that long, so I thought I had to go. So I gave up this job that I adored, and off I went to Charlottesville with John, and it was very interesting because I had never been east at all. And one weekend, I said, let's go see Washington, D.C. And he said, all right, because he had traveled. He had been all over, and he'd been to Washington before.
This was your first trip east?
Yes. And so we drove to Washington, and it was in January, and it was so cold. It was snowy and freezing. And we got to the Supreme Court, because I wanted to see that, and it was closed. It was Saturday. So we walked up those magnificent marble steps, and we stood amongst the columns at the top by the big brass door. And I took a picture of John standing there in the columns. And I said, gee, this is the closest we'll ever get to the Supreme Court.
Do you think about being Chief Justice?
No, absolutely not.
I quoted my friend Walter Dellinger, saying if there's anybody who would and should be Chief Justice, it is you. No. You are the swing justice now?
No, well, I don't
have
like that
served
term
since
either.
1980. Well, I know you don't. We'll get to that.
Okay.
And I know. It's since 1981. You've got tenure there?
Yeah, no, but it doesn't work that way. Oh, dear. Now, most Chief Justices are drawn from off the court. You know, if you look back historically, the vast majority have come from outside the court.
That's not true.
Oh, yes, it is.
Not recent
yes.
true. No, not recently.
Well, the incumbent Chief Justice was from within the court,
right.
but not his predecessor.
Well, Berger, that's right. Berger was not.
And most of them have not. And so...
That's right. Earl Warren was not.
Now, Stone was different. He worked
Harlan
his
Stone.
way up,
Right.
yes. But most have not. And so
But
that
think
seems
about
to work
this.
well.
Now think about this for me for a second.
All right.
I want you to just think about this. 50 years ago, you can't get them to interview you.
Right.
And now you would be, if the president decides, if Rehnquist decides to retire first, and
That's
they need
a
a
big
new,
if.
that's a big if. Although he said to me and others that, you know, and we believe, journalists believe, you know, that he probably wants to do it when there's a Republican president. That's now. Wouldn't it be great, this sort of continuum from this brilliant graduate of Stanford Law School who couldn't get a job in a law firm, who all of a sudden, all of a sudden is the first woman Chief Justice.
No, see, that's
Having
something
been the first woman Justice, is the worst woman Chief Justice.
No, that's something the media would think was a neat arrangement, but in fact is not very sensible. I am old. Old.
So?
And a president.
Old means wise. Old
listen,
means
no,
experienced.
Well, not necessarily. But
old means
a sitting president acting wisely, will try to place someone on the court if an opportunity arises who's not old
Who
already.
can serve like Rehnquist has for 20 years.
Exactly. Right.
You're-
Okay, end of subject.
No, but just one last question for me. If you were asked, you would not turn
No.
it down.
Well, of course, it's ridiculous.
Of course,
Come
you'd
on.
have to accept it if he would ask you.
Look, end of subject.
Now, why? Why did you? Why do you object to the idea of swing justice between you and Justice Kennedy as being swing justices, meaning that you're in the middle, that you're a moderate? On the left, I can tell you who they are.
I don't know if it means that or not, but
You
I
do
think
know. With great
every-
respect, Justice
every-
O'Connor, you know what it means.
look, every justice has an equal voice in deciding every case, and every vote is equally weighted.
Right.
And I try to look at each one as it comes and decide it as best I can. And I can't even predict how all my colleagues are going to vote on all these cases. Maybe you can. You're an experienced journalist,
Right.
but I can't.
Well, good. You're right. Points well taken. All right, let me go back to where you were when I had you at the Supreme Court, when you were just visiting.
Yes,
So
okay.
you look at this wonderful, and you go up those steps and you see John Marshall's statue there.
I know.
God, it's impressive.
It's wonderful, except I couldn't see it there. Well, it was outside
Yeah,
at that time.
Now, did
Right.
you think, God, I'd like to come back to Washington? I mean, this is...
No. Oh, no. I knew I didn't want to come to Washington. I grew up on a ranch. We knew better than that.
Yeah. Well, no, okay.
Wisdom was not in Washington, D.C., from the perspective
right.
of Arizona ranchers.
Well, let me go back even further back to, you love the writer Wallace Stegner, right?
Yes.
Love him.
Yes.
Because what? What does he say about the West that so resonates with you?
Are you a Stegner fan? Have you read
Not as
some of
much
his
as you are.
wonderful
Yeah,
books?
I know, yes.
And he grew up in Saskatchewan area of Canada, in that kind of dry, open grassland area of Canada, where cattle were also raised and sheep.
Right.
And he grew up in a little town. He wasn't from a ranch family, but he knew the West, and he lived in the West all his life and wrote about it. And it was just embedded in him. If you read his descriptions of the West, you will understand exactly what it means to somebody like me, too.
And that's why it so
And
resonates with
when
you.
I was
And
at Stanford, I actually took a creative writing class from Wallace Stegner. And
Did it
I don't-
take?
No, I didn't think I learned much in the class, not because of him, but because I was very young, and my classmates in that class were veterans of World War II, and they had seen life, they had seen death, they had fought the great battles of World War II, and when Stegner would say, now I want you to write about something you know about, they could write about the most dramatic, meaningful thing that America had seen. And I felt so humble and outclassed in that company that I wasn't sure I had learned much, but I learned respect for Wallace Stegner.
And loved his writing.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much.
And the West resonates in you as much as it did,
Yes.
even if you can't express it quite as well as
Now,
he can.
at the end of his life, he was no longer optimistic that the West would remain as he knew it and loved it. He thought that it was getting overdeveloped and damaged by that and injured in ways that were irreparable.
What he said is, something will have gone out of us as a people if we ever let the remaining wilderness be destroyed.
Yes, and he saw that happening, and he was dismayed by what he saw.
Do you feel that too? We're losing
Well, there's
too
no
much of that?
question that we've lost enormous amounts and still are. I lived in Phoenix for 25 years, and it was settled by the Hohokam Indians before the time of Christ. And they had They built canals and used diverted water from the Salt River to irrigate their little fields. And when Phoenix first formed, it was agricultural. There were citrus groves and olive groves and date palms and maybe a little cotton and some vegetables. And with World War II, it became houses. I don't know if you've flown over Phoenix lately, but it's a little like Los Angeles.
Yeah, I know.
It's nonstop houses.
It's true. It is true.
And I don't know where the date palms and the olive groves
It's
and
true
the
of a lot of
citrus
cities
groves
like
have
that now. I
gone.
mean, there are a lot of cities, especially in the West and in the South,
Yeah.
which have experienced rapid
Yeah,
growth.
right.
That is just,
Right.
just exactly, you drive into them and it's one would be
Yes.
just like the other. What were you doing when you got the call that you'd might be nominated by President Reagan as an Associate Supreme Court Justice?
I got a phone call when I was home. I had just had surgery, and I was home in bed recuperating, and the telephone rang, and it was William French Smith. He was the Attorney General of the United States.
And
I
the
didn't
President's
know him.
lawyer, too.
Yes, and he had been a partner in the very California law firm that had said, "How would you like to be a legal secretary?"
This is a big LA firm. Yeah.
So
So did you remind him
he
of that?
said,
Did
well,
you say?
yeah, he said, I'd like to invite you to come back to Washington and talk to us about a position here. Now, I had immediately the sense that it was in connection with the Supreme Court. Justice Potter Stewart had
weren't
just
looking for a
announced his
secretary, were they?
retirement. But I said, "Oh, you must mean a secretarial position." So we had a few laughs over that.
He remembered?
Well, he had been doing his research.
Oh, so
I
he
don't
kn-
think
he knew your
knew
story.
that, but yeah, he'd been doing his research.
Now, did that turn down in any way make you an ardent, assertive exponent and advocate of women's rights?
It made me want to correct deficiencies and legal barriers to the
Eliminate
employment
them.
of women.
Yeah.
And I had a wonderful opportunity to do that very directly in my home state of Arizona, because I ended up in the Arizona State Senate, where I served for some years. And one of my projects was to go through every statute in Arizona and find the ones that I thought were discriminatory against women or that provided barriers to their employment, and to try to correct it, and offered legislation to change all that, which passed. And that was very satisfying. Arizona was a community property state, which I thought was wonderful. That's a holdover from Spanish days and Spanish law. But when I was first in the Senate, all the management and control of the community property was that of the husband. And the husband was permitted to even dispose of any of the community property without the consent of the wife. And I found that very troublesome indeed. So
what did you do about it?
Well, got the law changed.
There you go.
Yeah,
All right.
that was helpful.
So William French Smith says, come to Washington, we want to talk to you about a position. It's not a secretarial position.
Right.
You know it's the Supreme Court. I mean,
Yes.
you probably had been
Yes.
I've forgotten what it was like in the present time, but it probably you were on the list. As we know, for example, that
He later told me that when he took the job as Attorney General, one of the first things he did was to try to start compiling a list of possible people for Supreme Court positions in case there were a vacancy during President Reagan's term. And he said he kept that list in his own hand under his telephone in his office, and that he had put my name on the list somehow. I'm not quite sure how
You
that
don't know
got
how?
there.
Yeah.
Well, I really don't.
So what happened then? You went to Washington and you were interviewed?
I had a meeting in Washington anyway. I said, I'll call my doctor and see if I can go. And the doctor said, well, all right, if you don't carry anything. And so I went, and I had a meeting because I was on a national medical Commission. And so I went to that meeting, and I arranged to meet with President Reagan's advisors at a place designated by Attorney General Smith. And the first night that I arrived, the Smiths were living at the Jefferson Hotel in an apartment in the hotel. And he invited me to come and have dinner with Attorney General Smith and his wife, which I did, and that was my first chance to meet them, and they were so nice. His wife had gone to Stanford, so we had a lot of Stanford
And how
talk.
soon thereafter did they announce the appointment, the nomination?
It was about 10 days after I returned home from Washington.
Had Reagan been a political hero of yours?
I was active in Republican politics in Arizona, and I thought he was a very attractive candidate for the Republicans.
Identified with his
he
politics and his values?
Well, one of the things he had supported in California was a provision in the California Constitution to limit the state debt to a ratio of income in the state, so that the state was not going to increase its debt year after year. And I tried to pattern a similar proposal for Arizona, which I did get passed, and I had talked to him a time or two about that proposal.
Was Barry Goldwater a political hero?
Yes, he was a very special man, and he was a neighbor of ours. We lived in the area that became Paradise Valley. It's sandwiched between Scottsdale and Phoenix. And he had a beautiful house up on the hill, and we were down on the flat land by the canal, but I could see his house from our house. And we were in the same political precinct. And so I used to carry petitions and that kind of thing.
When you arrived at the Supreme Court, how was it? What was it like for you as the first woman associate justice?
Well, it was a very intense experience, to say the least.
Intense because you
Because
felt like you had...
of all of the attention that was being given nationwide, indeed worldwide, to the fact that finally, after 191 years, a woman had been put on the Supreme Court of the United States. And there was enormous interest in it. And it was a very difficult job, and it's hard enough to do without a lot of media attention being given to it. And frankly, you and your colleagues paid too much attention to it, I thought.
Why?
It was not
why did we-
comfortable.
Well, but I mean, except for the uncomfortable, because it made you uncomfortable, why
It
shouldn't we have
did.
paid attention to it? Because it was a historic
Yes,
appointment.
that's fine, but then let's move on and let's let the work be done. And it didn't seem to work that way, because everywhere that Sandra went, the press was sure to go.
Sure.
And I even had situations of being at public functions, talking to people, and all of a sudden seeing inserted in the middle of the circle of people talking a long arm with a microphone on it, inserted by some member of the press hoping to pick up conversation that was not intended to be.
Boy, can you imagine what it would be
given to
like
the
if you
press.
accept the Supreme Chief Justiceship?
Well, that was most unfortunate. And then we learned later that other people had been sifting through our trash, hoping to find things in our trash that they could.
You're not
Quote,
the first person in Washington that's happened to.
No, but it's not pleasant.
Oh, I'm sure it's not.
No. Anyway, the work was hard, and it was just the most electrifying moment was the first time that I went in our conference room to talk about actual cases, to try to go around the table and to resolve the cases that had been argued that week.
It must be a
It was hard to believe that I was seated at that table with my 8 colleagues and
Who
would
was
be
there
given
at the
an
time you were
equal
appointed?
voice. Well, Chief Justice Warren Burger, and Justice Brennan, William Brennan, Justice Thurgood Marshall,
Wow.
Justice Harry Blackmun,
Wow.
Justice Byron White.
Wow. Stanford. No,
No.
Harvard, appointed by Jack Kennedy.
Yes. And famous football
That's
player
right,
in his day, and wonderful justice.
Wizard,
And
they called him, from the
well,
University of Colorado.
if you called him that, you weren't his friend.
Oh, they didn't like that. He
No,
didn't like
he
that.
did not like that. And
'Cause that's what they called him as a
my
football player.
wonderful colleague, Lewis Powell from Virginia.
Right, from Richmond.
And he was the kindest man that ever lived. And all of them said, oh, if there's any way we can help you, we're glad to, let me know. But everybody's too busy, really, and you'd feel foolish running around and saying, well, how do I do this? What do I do with cert petitions? And nobody in my office had ever worked in a Supreme Court chambers before. The secretaries hadn't, my law clerks hadn't, I hadn't. We didn't know what to do. And there's no how to do it manual.
Plus you had the additional burden of...
Well, it was very hard. So each of my clerks took 2 chambers to research and find out how they handled the paper flow. What did they do? And Lewis Powell, bless his soul, offered to let me hire his second secretary. Every justice has 2 secretaries. And his second secretary was wonderful.
Because she'd been there.
She'd been there, and she was intelligent and marvelous. And I jumped at the chance. And the minute she came, order was restored in my chambers.
What's the most exhilarating thing about being a justice? The most satisfying?
The most satisfying thing is the privilege of working at work that's worth doing. And it is. It's work that's important to all of us.
Because any case that gets to the Supreme Court has great import.
Well, it has some import at the national level.
Otherwise, you wouldn't grant it certiorari.
Yes, it's an important issue of federal law, or we wouldn't take it.
Right.
And it's an issue on which lower courts have differed, or we wouldn't take it normally. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part. And it's an issue in which you can usually make very good arguments on either side.
Are you influenced as a justice by what happens when you sit around the table and talk about the cases? I mean, do you listen to other justices and say...
Oh, very much so. And sometimes...
Oh, that's a good point.
Yes, sometimes one of your colleagues will bring out something or an approach that perhaps you haven't thought of and that is important to you and might cause you to say, well, I hadn't thought about what so-and-so said, but I'll look into that, and that might provide a solution. I mean, you might qualify whatever you're going to say by saying, I've just listened now to what so-and-so said, and that might be a solution as well. I'll think about it.
Have you changed your opinion on important issues? On what issues?
Uh-huh. Well, through the years, a number. In one instance, I had a remarkable thing happen. We had a case, and it was during the Chief Justice Berger years, and the decision coming out of the conference was 5-4, and I was given the writing assignment for the majority, and I worked on an opinion for quite a while, and I became increasingly disenchanted. And the more I worked on it...
Even though you're writing the majority?
The more I worked on it, the more I became convinced I was wrong.
Wow.
And I finally wrote a letter to the Chief Justice with copies to the conference saying, the more I've worked on it, the more I think that I have made a mistake here and that the case should be resolved the other way and it should be reassigned. And so that caused the assignment to go from the Chief Justice to the most senior Associate Justice on the other side.
How many times has that
who
happened?
I don't know, not very often.
But more than one?
But turned around, not to me,
Yeah.
but it has happened.
Yeah.
And he turned around and assigned it back to me to write for the other side. Very unusual.
Do you like writing the opinions?
Well, it's a challenge. I like it when things go together well, and when you think that you've been able to muster some compelling arguments, and when you end up with a court for a position that you think is sound, that's satisfying.
Abortion has been the most controversial thing you faced in 21 years?
Well, that probably, in the election case.
This would be Bush versus Gore. Did the court serve itself well in that decision?
I'm not the one to ask that.
I know. I'm only smiling because I know you don't like to talk about it.
I don't like to talk about cases generally.
Yeah, but that one
I'm
was
not-
so controversial and got
Yes.
so much attention, and
Yes, it
some
did.
say that the court determined the election. They do say that.
Yes, some say that, right.
Was it hard? I mean, everybody there? I have one question, then I'll leave. I promise. What was it? I mean, take us there. Was it the most difficult, intense time since you've been on the court?
Oh, I don't know about that.
Was it the hardest time for
difficult.
you? Because you
No,
knew what was at
I mean,
stake.
lots of them.
But you knew what was at stake here. The presidency was at stake.
Well, I'm not going to talk about the case because I just thought, I'd make it a practice not to talk about the case.
You understand why I have to ask?
That's fine, but I choose not to, if that's okay.
No, of course, it's fine. When you look at the future, not about specific cases, but help us understand what you think the important issues are that this country and what a lot of is going to have to face.
Well, the amazing thing about the court, if you look at its cases over a substantial period of time, is the fact that every significant issue in America ends up at the court in one aspect or another. They all get there. It's astonishing. It really is. Maybe not directly the big issue, but some related aspect of it.
It is true.
Yeah.
I mean,
now we see concern about terrorism, and we see new legislation to deal with it. And there's no doubt in my mind that down the road, heaven knows how many years down the road, but down the road sometime, there will be some cases in the lower courts testing the interpretation of those new laws, perhaps their constitutionality, and they'll work their way up, like everything does.
Let me make it even clearer, even more immediate. Most people believe that the issue of campaign finance reform might get to the court.
It has in the past. It wouldn't surprise me if it did again, if there are new laws, and if they're tested in court, as they may well be, then over time you will see something like that
And
come back
abortion is
around.
working its way back from a case in Ohio, I think it is, from Ohio.
Yeah. All these issues seem to surface in our courts generally, not just this one. I mean, they start in the lower courts and work their way along.
You have believed, as a matter of judicial philosophy, that if in fact a state court had given an issue full and appropriate treatment, that the United States, it wasn't necessary for the Supreme Court of the United States to hear a case.
Well, it certainly might be. Suppose the courts of one state have decided an issue of federal law this way, and the state courts in another state have decided that same issue of federal law in another way.
Right. So you got a federal
Of
question.
course, it's a federal issue, a federal question. No, state courts are not insulated from review.
But
by
generally,
any
as a matter of
stretch.
judicial policy, of philosophy, you tend to
No, I think
I can't put those words in your mouth,
No.
can I?
No, but what I do think is perhaps a result of my years of working in all three branches of state government is to recognize that the framers of the Constitution did leave a role for states and for local government in resolving many issues. And the Constitution that was drafted preserved the sovereignty of states for a number of purposes. And so that constitutional framework should be observed and preserved.
How have you, I mean, can you help us understand how you have changed while you've been sitting on the court in terms of an approach to
Well, I hope
law?
I've learned a few things going along. I didn't know much about many of the issues the court addresses when I came to the court. And it's a learning process. I hope that I've learned quite a bit in the years I've been there. But the remarkable thing is that we continue to get issues that send you right back to the books to do research and to learn more about it.
And how much of that research is done by the law clerks?
Oh,
and
they
how much
do
of
a
that is done by
lot.
the justice? And
They
how
do
does
a
the
lot.
justice sort of interact with the law clerks?
Meet with them every day, and they're wonderful. One of the great pleasures, really, of working at the court is the privilege of having these marvelous young lawyers who serve as our law clerks. They're really the best young lawyers in the country, and they're just a joy to be around.
And
They're
you
great.
get to select 2 each year?
4.
4?
4.
My goodness.
Ooh, yes. So, and they're marvelous. They
Is there
come
any
from all across the
experience that
country.
you might have wished you'd had? I mean, would you have been a better Supreme Court justice if you had served on a state court, for example?
I did. I'd be a, yeah, I
You know what I mean.
I
You-
should
you
have,
know.
I perhaps would have been much better prepared if I'd served on a federal court somewhere along the
Right.
line, which I had not. And in the early days of the country, that was not uncommon, but these days, the usual path is to select people who've served on the Federal Court of Appeals somewhere along the line.
Most people, I assume, know this, but you don't have to be a lawyer, and you do not have to have served. You don't have to have served, obviously, as any particular thing to be a member of the Supreme Court.
Right.
What are the requirements to be a judge?
Well,
a
you
justice?
have to be a certain age, and
Is it 35?
that's about it, yes. And you have to be nominated,
moral-
and you
yeah,
have
right.
to be
Confirmed
confirmed
by
by
the
the
Senate,
Senate, and that
yeah.
can be quite a challenge, I think. If you're not a lawyer and haven't had any experience, it
You
might
probably
be
will not
pretty
make
hard.
it.
But, you know, the last justice to serve who had never gone to law school, I think, was Justice Jackson, Robert Jackson. And he was a fabulous justice. And he had a way with words that was just marvelous, admirable.
Let me read some of these questions
Okay.
to share them with you. Do you believe your love of the West, rugged individualism, and self-reliance created a bond between you and Ronald Reagan? That's sort of what I asked, but go ahead.
No, well, not that, but I do remember that when he saw me in the Oval Office on that trip I made to Washington, he was sort of interested in learning about my ranch experience.
Yes. So he felt like
could
there was,
relate to
he
that.
thought there was a bond
He
there
could relate
that he
to
relate
that.
to.
Yes.
Here's an interesting question that in the context of our conversation. With over 50% of all law school graduates now being women, and less than 20% of all partners in law firms being women, do you think that the legal profession has really changed as much as it should with respect to promoting women since the time that you graduated?
Oh, well, the change has just been so dramatic, and the question itself illustrates it. This year,
More than 50?
more than half of entering law students are women. I think that's incredible because when I went to law school, it was a handful of women in law schools. And in my law school, the same. This has just been a sea change. And they aren't there in full numbers yet in the law firms, but they will be. And I think one thing that perhaps has continued some disparity in the law school, in the law firm percentages of partners, is the fact that a good many women have wanted to have children and have families. Yeah. And some of them have chosen to do what I did, which was to stay home for a while with children. I stayed home 5 years at one point when my children were very small. And I was scared that I'd never get a job again as a lawyer. I was terrified. So I tried to keep my hand in by volunteer activities in the legal profession, and things worked out pretty well in the long run.
You've done okay.
Yeah.
Do you think I could look at the opinions of Sandra Day O'Connor and the opinions of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and see any commonality because of gender?
You know, Justice Ginsburg and I have addressed that question, and we're often asked that question. And I think we both have the same answer to it.
Well,
which
maybe there's somebody in this audience or me that hasn't heard that.
Okay.
What would you say?
Well, we tend to think that a wise old woman and a wise old man reach the same decision at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's what I...
Yeah, yeah. But we may have, I think our experiences are sometimes useful in the discussion and in the process.
Yeah, because I mean, you two have had very different experiences. I mean, she is
we
a product of an urban life.
Yes, of urban life.
Yeah.
And yet, when it came to going to law school and trying to get a job, our experiences were quite parallel.
She had the same kind of
Yeah, she had a hard time.
hard struggle to get a...
In law school, being accepted.
But do you think
as
it shaped you the same? Both of you?
Well, I think we had very similar experiences at the law school and first job stage.
But did it shape you the same way? I mean, you had the same experiences. Do you think you reacted to the experience the same way? You must have talked about
Pretty
this.
much.
You
yeah,
did. With
I
a certain
do.
sense of determination and
Yes. Yes.
anger and disappointment.
Yes. And it was a great pleasure to me to have another woman come on the Supreme Court, I can tell you. And one as able as Justice Ginsburg has been a real joy. She's fabulous. Really is.
You'll like this.
Yeah.
Now that you can't go to the ranch, where do you go? She goes to Charlottesville. Where do you go? John, where does she go?
Well, I like to go to Montana and maybe catch a fish.
Do you a fly fisherman?
Yeah, I like
a fly
to do
fisher
that.
person or
Yeah,
whatever? Yeah?
Yeah, I like to do that.
Yeah. Do you still ride?
Not very often. I have a little arthritis, and boy, does that make me stiff and sore.
Yes. You are also a survivor of breast cancer.
Yes.
And have been, strong advocate of research. And,
Very much so. Yeah. Right.
Here's another question. Aside from the constitutional issues of Roe versus Wade, what are your personal opinion about a woman's right to choose?
Well, I've written a good deal on the subject
I know
of
you
abortion issues, so I think I'll
So if you want to know more about what you think on abortion issues, read what you've
refer
written.
people to the cases. You might look at Casey, for instance,
The Casey, was this Governor Casey of
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania? It shows you how a lot of these questions are things I already asked you, but are Supreme Court pundits accurate when they describe you as the ideological moderate between Justice Scalia and Ginsburg?
Well, you know, Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg are very good friends. And if you look at the cases, you'll find they agree on many of them. It's not some wild, constant battle going on there by any stretch of the imagination.
Scalia and Ginsburg agree on
Right.
many issues.
Right. You know, they served together, well,
Somebody said name one, yeah.
administrative law issues and just the basics.
They differed on
Sure.
Gore versus Bush.
Sure. And other cases,
Was it Bush versus
too.
Gore or Gore versus Bush? I've forgotten which.
Well, I think we ended up with both, probably.
Okay.
But
But they disagreed on that.
yeah, they did.
Justice Scalia is another person that's mentioned because he is younger as a possible
Yes,
Supreme Court justice.
yes.
What was the single most important thing that you learned at law school that you've used in your decisions on the court? That's a hard
Well,
one.
at law school is a process of teaching you how to think about factual situations and problems and to parse them out and make sense of them in terms of legal issues and solutions. And I just think that's what law schools train people to do. So of course that is precisely the process we undertake all the time at the court.
Yeah, it really
and
is.
it's funny how often I will think back when I'm in a given area of the law to teachers, law professors I had in law school, and how they might have approached something. It's funny how those memories come back.
Law school does teach you how to think.
Yes, how to think.
Really, regardless of whether you do what I do as a law
You
school
went to law school.
I did. And everybody always says, do you think it's good if you want to be a journalist or do what I do, interviewing probably more people than anyone else does. And it makes you think about issues. You can analyze material and in a constructive way and figure out how to approach it. And that's what it gives you, a kind of methodology of thinking.
I think today's law schools are doing a little better job, too, of teaching young lawyers how to reach a consensus position and solve problems. They're teaching negotiating skills, for instance, which is a wonderful thing, because that's a role that lawyers can fill very well.
Yeah. In the same way, it's interesting how in the discipline, in medicine, for example, I mean, they're teaching a lot of things that they haven't taught before, both in terms of a lot of things that, in terms of the impact of nutrition, just a small example.
Exactly.
I mean, medical schools are slow coming to some of these subjects, as well as sort of the notion of how to relate to patients, that kind of thing, in an era in which technology and drugs and all have taken over medicine. What is the biggest misconception about the Supreme Court, you think?
That everything is secret, because it isn't. You know, we have three branches of government, and the only one where the positions of everybody are always explained in full, in writing, for everybody to see, is the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't get that out of Congress. You don't get that out of the White House, you know. So it really, I think that is a misconception.
There is that. I mean, The Brethren gave us, did you read The Brethren by Bob Woodward?
Yes.
Was that a review?
Well,
what?
it was written about a different court in a different era.
It was, in fact, but it clearly it had a lot of sources from inside the court.
It sounded like it,
didn't it? It sure did. I mean, was anything about that you thought was wrong, I mean, in terms of the court you know?
Yes.
What was
it? Well, it just pictured a lot of inside maneuvering that I don't think takes place.
Really?
Really. And really. And the interesting, now I've served in all three branches of state government, and when I was in the legislature, I was in a position to see how some legislator might say, gee, I'll support you on your bill if you'll support me on mine. That kind of thing.
Right, happens all the time.
I have not seen one instance of anything remotely resembling that at the Supreme Court.
Justice Sandra Day O'Connor comes here to say, I have never seen a vote traded for another vote in the Supreme Court in my 21 years of sitting on that court. No one's ever come to say, look, I'm helping you on this, please help me on this.
No.
You know, because...
No. And I think that's fantastic. It is a place where every justice really tries to do a good job with everything they get and just give it the best shot you can. And the persuasion takes place primarily at the writing stage. When you circulate an opinion draft, that's where you try to write persuasively enough that others will agree. Now, you do a little bit of it around the conference table, but we don't talk very long, and it isn't the place where you really hammer things out.
Now, here's another aspect of the court, too, is I don't think most people perhaps don't appreciate. The Chief Justice has a lot of power.
The power of assignment of many of the cases is very important.
I mean, he runs the court.
Yes, he leads the conference discussion and speaks first and then goes around the table. At the end of the day, the Chief Justice has only one vote.
But he can choose
like
who writes the
anyone
opinion?
If he's in the majority.
If he's in the majority.
That's a big if. If he's not making the assignment.
Has the court itself, I mean, how has it changed since you've been there in terms of has this changed in the composition?
It's changed dramatically 6 times because there have been 6 new appointments since I've been there.
In 21 years, there have been
Yes.
6 new appointments. And each time...
Each time it changes the court because we work together as a small group, 9 people, constantly working together.
Right.
You get used to how everybody operates and what they say and how they do it. And then you change one member of the 9, and it's a new court. When
Felix Frankfurter was there, I mean, we think of the court as always having in its history, back to John Marshall, Justice Rehnquist's favorite judge. Yours? Who's your favorite in history?
The great Chief Justice, I think most people acknowledge, was John Marshall.
Right. Is he your...
There were others, but he was remarkable.
Because he gave what?
Well, he put flesh and bones on the Constitution.
Yeah.
It's a very spare document. It's this skinny little thing.
You have it in your pocketbook?
Sure, I do.
You do? Let me see
sure
your...
I do.
See your...
Yeah, let's
see
dig it
your
out.
Constitution.
Let's dig it out. There it is.
There it is, look.
That's a skinny little thing.
Constitution of the United States.
I mean, it's not very big, is it?
No.
And part of that are the Bill of Rights and some data in the back. It's really, I mean, just here it is, 16 pages.
Yeah.
And John Marshall he did not sit in Philadelphia to draft it, but he fought in the Revolution, you know, with George Washington and was in the Revolution most of the time. And he was a very congenial sort of a man, we're told.
Right.
And when he became Chief Justice, they'd get a case and it would pose some fundamental issue of the meaning of the Constitution, the breadth of the Commerce Clause, or something basic. And he'd say, well, I'll be glad to try to write an opinion if you want. And they'd all say, yes, why don't you do it? So he wrote almost all the opinions for that court. He served there 33 years. And most of the time he wrote the opinions. And so he was the one who crafted them. And he wrote in Marbury versus Madison, which we look to as a case exemplifying the notion that there is the power of judicial review of acts of Congress for constitutionality. That was so fundamental, not very clearly expressed in the Constitution. But of all the people we look to from the early days as being important in the framing of the Constitution, like Madison and Franklin and Washington, Hamilton, we better put John Marshall in there, because while he didn't write it, he interpreted it. And much of what we have today is the result of his work.
We have had in the history of the court these great intellectual battles because of the towering people. I think of between Hugo Black and Felix Frankfurter, and you go back to some amazing. Do we have that intellectual vigor on the court today?
Yes, I think you have a lot of intellectual firepower on the court today, and some remarkable decision-making, really. Yes, I think you've got a very good court.
Because this back to, but one more time to Gore versus Bush, because a lot of people listened to that because it was immediately brought out. As you pointed out to me backstage, the court has made its opinions available on audio tape before, but it's always a long time after the decision. And this was almost immediate, the same day, in fact.
Yes.
Most people that I know think the court came out really extraordinarily well. I mean, they came out with great respect for the process of two people as advocates coming up trying to make a case, and people like you giving them a tough time trying to work your way through.
People heard the arguments and the questioning, and that's good. I'm sure that was of great interest.
How do you approach oral argument as
a lot of preparation, a lot of homework.
Yeah.
In early days of the court, we're told that some of the justices liked to go into court not having read anything, so they could just hear it for the first time.
Be spontaneous.
But that was when arguments could last a very long time. And that's not our practice today. We have limited time for oral arguments, and we do a tremendous amount of reading and preparation before the oral argument, where unless we write the opinion, we'll know as much about the case by the time we've prepared for the oral argument as we'll ever know about it. So a lot of front-end time goes into that preparation, and it should.
Do you see a lot of the, I mean, I think of people like Larry Tribe on constitutional issues. Do you see a lot of the same lawyers coming back because they made it a practice of being part of the Supreme Court bar?
We see some who appear more than once at the court, but on the other hand, we've heard some wonderful arguments from lawyers from some small town someplace across America who've never been there before. They'll never be there again, but they know the subject, and they make a very good presentation.
Yeah, how great must that be to be standing there in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing on behalf of some case that you believe in and that you have probably followed all the way through the court, unless they've hired some appellate lawyer to handle it.
No, it's very satisfying to me to see somebody come from some outlying area and do well. And I remember a case involving Indian law, and Indian law is such an arcane thing in our field of federal law, and we had two lawyers from little towns in Montana who'd never been there before, and they'll never be there again, and they were both fabulous. It was really informative for the justices.
You're going to write another book.
Well, I probably am in the yes, I think so.
Was this a satisfying experience for you, to think about your father and your mother and growing up and the silence of the ranch?
Yes, in the long run it was, because it's the only thing that we were able to salvage from it.
Yeah,
memories.
Memories, that's my point. Was it also
memories.
Painful so often because...
Somewhat, but more importantly, we salvaged memories that I hope others will be able to share and maybe derive some values from as well.
What do you regret most about your life?
Oh, not having read more than I've read. I spend all my waking hours reading, but I wish I could spend more.
And who's had the most influence on you?
Oh, I'm sure my parents.
Mother and father.
Mm-hmm. To some extent, my grandmother. I lived with her for all those school years.
And if you look at, I assume, if you look at those moments where we make important choices about our life, certainly it's choice of spouse, and you've had a long and happy marriage in which you've spoken about, but it's also choice of profession.
I decided to apply to law school because of a professor at Stanford. As an undergraduate, I took a law course offered to undergraduates, and the professor was a man named Harry Rathbun, and he was fabulous. And he just worked so hard to persuade each of us that an individual can make a difference in life, that a single individual, if you really care and exert an effort, can make a difference in what happens. And he was so persuasive, and I thought part of that was his legal training. And because of him, I applied to law school.
And made all the difference.
Made a difference in my life.
How long will you want to stay on the court?
I don't know.
Until it gets, you don't know, but I mean, what would influence your decision?
If I think I
Capacity
can't do
would
the
be one.
job adequately, then it's time to get off.
Have you been there when you thought justices stayed too long?
Well, I haven't seen it, no.
Justice Thomas never speaks much in oral argument.
Not too often.
You're wonderful. You are.
What can I say? Oh, dear.
You are. We are out of time. I know you're sad about that.
Oh, very.
But the reason is these good people want to to come, I assume. And are we signing books tonight or not? I don't know the answer. Are we going to do that? Yes. We are?
I think
My
that's
goodness.
part of the deal.
Please join me in
Okay.
thanking the very fine Justice Sandra Day O'Connor.
Thank you.
That wasn't painful, was it?
Well, a little bit. Gee whiz.